Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Ann Lockwood. As one of the leaders of Resilient Cities, I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar, Protecting Our History from Rising Water. Before we hear from the panelists, here are a few details for your ease and convenience. If you experience any technical difficulties, you can contact our tech expert, Stuart Mader, in the chat bar, or you can log off and reconnect. You're welcome to take notes, and we will post a recording of this webinar on our website within the next few days. So we are recording. Meanwhile, we will post each panelist's presentation on our website today, immediately following the webinar. You can use the chat function for questions and comments. We are allotting the bulk of the next 60 minutes to panelist presentations rather than Q&A. Recognizing that timing, all of our panelists are willing to field questions afterward. You'll see their emails both in their presentations and in the chat bar, so you can sit back and enjoy. Our moderator today is Alan Kratz, also a member of the leadership team of Resilient Cities. Alan's volunteer activities encompass both historic preservation and climate resilience, as you can see on the screen. So Alan.
Thank you, Ann. And because all of us who are eager to preserve the architectural heritage of our communities also want to invest in protecting our communities from flooding, those of us in Resilient Cities are happy to bring together today 5 experts to help us address the challenge of simultaneously protecting our historic built environment and adapting our communities to climate change, especially the effects of our rising ocean. So here's a preview of our 5 panelists. Architect Dominique Hawkins, founder of Preservation Design Partnership in Philadelphia, has developed design guidelines for historic districts throughout the United States and has helped communities in Maryland and New Jersey figure out how to protect historic sites from rising water. And I mentioned the United States, and we have registrants for this panel, for this webinar today, from Maine to Hawaii to the Virgin Islands and all points in between, many points in between. So it's delightful to see how many people are engaged in this subject from across the country. One of the communities that is implementing Dominique's recommendations is Baltimore, where Lauren Shisick works as a historic preservation specialist for the city's Commission on Historical and Architectural Preservation. Architect Anna Sanchez will show us literally the ABCs of dry flood proofing a historic library. That library project will be featured in the National Park Service's forthcoming illustrated guidelines, and Jennifer Wellock, an architectural historian with the Park Service, will show us additional examples of sensitive flood risk reduction projects. She'll be giving us a preview of what will be fully public next month. So we'll see that on our webinar today. And finally, because Resilient Cities focuses on funding and financing climate adaptation, we'll conclude with Janet Foster of the New Jersey Historic Trust, an entity of state government that provides grants and loans to protect historic sites. And I know Janet has good new information about funding when we get to her presentation. So let's get started with an overview by Dominique Hawkins.
Well, thank you. Doing an overview of flooding in 20 minutes or less is hard, so I'm just going to start talking. Next, please. So one of the things to keep in mind is that many historic communities are located on water. Water actually provided not only transportation, it provided a means of commerce, and it also provided, food and drink. So looking at historic maps, you can usually tend to find where historic communities were located. This slide actually illustrates a historic map to a current map of New Jersey. And one of the things that we have done over time to gain real estate is that we have actually modified our waterways and filled them in or put them through culverts so that we can have more developable land. The problem is the water still needs to go somewhere. Next, please. So historic cities, as I said, are located on water. This is the city of New Orleans. These are all the historic districts. This represents over 47,000 properties in all of those shaded boxes. And that's the Mississippi River that is running through the city. Next, please. This is St. Augustine, Florida, which has been recently hit by a few hurricanes. I'm currently working in St. Augustine on a flood mitigation project there for their historic districts. And as you can see, they are literally surrounded by water. Next. Historic communities inland also face challenges. So this is Exeter, New Hampshire. I took this photograph in 2016. Next. By 2020, they actually, to manage the problems associated with water, modified the waterway that ran through town. Next. Many of our associations with flooding and problems with flooding are coastal. And these are the events that usually get the most attention. So the hurricanes coming into town, which also has an impact of wind. Next. But many people deal with flooding literally on a daily basis. So something called nuisance flooding or persistent flooding is when you have the high tides, et cetera, the king tides associated with full moons. People are dealing with water and having to adapt themselves to the fact that water is infiltrating their neighborhoods. In part, this is due to climate change, sea level rise, and what's called subsidence, or literally the lowering of the ground. Won't get into the science of that, but when you take a situation where you have a high tide and add a major storm on top of it, then you can get catastrophic events similar to Superstorm Sandy. Next, please. Flooding can actually occur from other sources. So ice can back up under a bridge overpass, and that can cause flooding upstream. And it's not just ice, it can also be debris. So if you have a lot of debris in a river and a bridge with a lot of abutments or buttresses, then that can actually hold back the debris and cause flooding behind it. Next. You can also get inland flooding. So a lake can fill up and cause flooding around its coast. Next. Riverine flooding is where rivers rise. So this is actually, this is a half a block from my office. This is the Manayunk Historic District, and I wrote a flood guide for the city of Philadelphia addressing riverine flooding. So take a look at that deck. So this is off the back of a building that has been converted, former mill building that has been converted to a restaurant. Next. That's a flood. So this was, and look at that sunny sky. So I literally sat at my desk and I watched the gauges on the river, and I said, it's time for me to take another walk. And I went and took that photograph. Next. So flooding can have catastrophic effects, and particularly, as I said, when mixed with storms. So this is a result of Superstorm Sandy. Next. As is this. Next. So this is again back in Manayunk. So it's also, commercial properties, small homes. Next. And again, just that nuisance flooding, and those high water signs are things that a lot of communities just have handy, because it's often a thing that communities are dealing with, including places like Baltimore. This is Annapolis. Next. In 2016 and 2018, there were two 1,000-year floods in Ellicott City, which ripped through their main street. And not only did it devastate Main Street, but it actually also caused loss of life. And what the term 1,000-year storm means is that, based upon the historic record of past, or the known record of past storm events, it was a storm of such intensity that it would be anticipated to happen only one every 1,000 years. They had two of these in 2 years in a row, and this is riverine flooding. So this was a rising river. Next, please. Devastated downtown and caused huge economic upset in the town. Also resulted in clear destruction of buildings. And some hard choices about how to move forward. Next, please. So one of the things that I think gets lost in terms of flooding is, particularly in the East Coast, we think of flooding as, or along the shorelines, we think of flooding as a coastal problem. Flooding is actually a pervasive problem across this country. So this article, this image came out of the New York Times from June of 2020. And the map on the left is the official FEMA estimate of flooding or flood vulnerable properties. And this is what the flood insurance rate maps or FIRM maps are based on. The estimate on the right represents an independent researcher's estimate of vulnerable flooded or properties that are vulnerable to flooding. So as you can see, a lot of the middle of the country and all of its coasts are extraordinarily vulnerable to flooding. Next, please. So how do we figure out what the impact is on historic buildings? So what we really have to do is really understand where are historic properties relative to where the threat of water is. So this is St. Michael's on the eastern shore of Maryland. The red squares are properties within their historic district. The purple boundaries are the boundaries of that district. And the blue is looking at flooding. So one of the challenges that many people face is that the flood insurance rate maps, which FEMA prepares, are based upon historical data associated with flooding. They do not account for either climate change or subsidence. So the result is that they are not forward-looking and they don't really represent the level of threat. So in thinking about what or how we protect historic properties from flooding, we have to understand what our baseline is and where we are anticipating that threat to go. So one of the, from the perspective of a community, it's generally better to protect a community as a whole than have each individual property owner make choices about how to protect their building. So in looking at community-wide mitigation standards, you really have to get buy-in from the community as a whole. And it usually means moving resources from one thing to another to get that buy-in and get that commitment financially and in terms of people. It also generally requires large swaths of land to make it happen. So I'm going to start by looking at some of the community mitigation strategies, and then we'll go into property-specific ones. Next, please. So community-wide mitigation strategies, one of the sort of most popular ones, or the 5 categories, are shoreline and bank protection. So basically something that keeps the water away at a defined shoreline. Stormwater systems are also a threat. If you can't get the stormwater off the streets or away from properties quick enough, then that presents a threat. Community utilities and infrastructure are actually extraordinarily vulnerable to flooding. And if they are not well placed in a community, it can cause problems. If you physically can't get there, your bridges or roads are unable to, or are inundated under water changes, then that becomes an issue. And there are also policy changes you can do to improve your flood resilience. Next, please. So shoreline protection comes in 2 forms, 2 overall forms. There's structural versions and there are natural versions. The current thinking is natural versions are generally better, but I'll just run through the variations of these. So structural shoreline protection along the shore basically is creating some sort of a physical constructed barrier to keep the water away. So you can do it along rivers, you can do it along coasts, you can do it along bays, but it's usually some form of concrete or big heavy stones or something that is designed to really physically keep the water away. When you go offshore, what you're really trying to do is break up the waves or the force of the water as it moves towards the shore. So that's what breakwaters and jetties are. Next, please. So natural shoreline protection generally takes a lot more physical space, and it can include reestablishing wetlands or floodplains and Reestablishing floodplains or wetlands generally means removing development out of those areas, and that includes both buildings and paving. Reestablishing dunes along shorelines and beach nourishment. So in New Jersey, where you have literally kind of the mile-wide beaches, that actually helps protect those properties inland from flooding. Next, please. Stormwater management is both engineered and can be quasi-natural. So engineered options include how you manage water off of roadways, whether or not, for example, in this case, the water coming off the roadways goes into a culvert and is absorbed into the ground, or whether or not you're taking that water and taking it to a facility that processes it and then dumps it into a river. Pumping stations and water storage and retention ponds. And the concept is similar to LEED or LEED design, which is sort of green building design, where you're trying to get as much water to be absorbed into the ground as possible and not diverting it into waterways. Next, please. Natural versions of this include levees and berms, swales, which are depressions in the land to direct water in certain ways, reducing impervious surface coverage, which is getting away from as much paved surface as possible, and using natural plantings and things like rain gardens, like is illustrated in this picture, where the water from that downspout is actually dumping into an area and is slowly being absorbed into the ground. Next, please. So as I mentioned, one of the key things is the utilities and infrastructure. If you do not have fresh water, access to sewage or electricity, it's really difficult to live in a place. And as water tables are rising and things like wells are getting brackish and undrinkable, and septic systems are being overrun, or existing treatment plants, water treatment plants are vulnerable to flooding, it becomes more and more challenging for people to live in a place. Next, please. And then there's getting there. So bridges, as I mentioned, can back up from debris. Next. And getting to and from places that are a little more remote can become next to impossible. Next. So policy changes includes ways to improve the building stock or the development of a community to improve its flood resilience. So one of the things that many communities are confronting at this point is that they haven't been utilizing zoning to minimize the amount of impervious surface coverage or development in their communities. So, you know, in many places, the revenues generated by a local municipality are based upon development. So if development is, I'm sorry, could we get rid of the chats underneath? These things are popping up. Thank you. If development is causing the funding of a community, there's an incentive to actually allow more development. Well, the reality is there's no place for the water to go when 81% of your surface is covered with paving or building. Next, please. So one of the things that's gotten a lot of people mobilized to be concerned about flooding is that flood insurance rates are actually going through the roof. And the reason they're going through the roof is the flood insurance program is supposed to be independently or self-funded, meaning you pay a premium into a pool of money, and from that pool of money, which is gathered from across the country, it's then distributed when there's an event. But if you think about recent past between Katrina, Harvey, Sandy, pick your names, Michael, Irma, I mean, I think everybody, depending on where they live, has a different version of this truth. The federal government has been paying out more and more in flood insurance than they have been getting in premiums. So as a result, they're starting there was an act passed in 2012 that mandated that the rate of the flood insurance rates actually go up to actually reflect the cost of the premium. So everyone's insurance is going up and everyone's kind of panicking at this point regarding flood insurance and are looking to improve their personal properties. Next, please. So in looking at what you can do at a building or property level, similar to a municipal level, there are certain landscape improvements you can do. These landscape improvements are generally geared towards minimizing the water that is put into a stormwater system and getting as much water to get absorbed into the ground as possible. Next, please. You can also maintain your building. A poorly maintained building is not going to resist a flood well. So keeping a building well maintained will increase its ability to withstand flood, both in terms of the rising water as well as force of water if that becomes an issue. You can also take your critical systems and equipment, so your heaters, your generators, your water heaters, et cetera, and raise them up and above the floodplain. And you can look into using secondary power sources, be it a solar collector or a generator, so that you can recover faster from a flood. Next, please. Oh, sorry, that image didn't quite work. There are also building improvements that you can do, which generally require working with an architect or a design professional. So they include elevation, wet flood proofing, dry flood proofing, which we'll hear more about later, perimeter barriers, relocation, and acquisition and demolition. Next. So what is elevation? It is literally picking a building up off the ground and raising it to a higher level. The process includes disconnecting all building systems. So wherever the electrical or the sewage connects to the building, you disconnect those lines. Put beams underneath, jack those beams up with the cribbing, as you see, and then set the house at or build a foundation up to the new height that's desired, drop the building down on it, and then reconnect all your systems. So that's the essence architecturally of what building elevation means. The challenge for preservationists is figuring out how do you make it still look like it fits in the neighborhood. I love this photograph because the welcome mat is still at the front door, even though the elevation has occurred. Next, please. One of the things that we have to look at is building elevation in a historic context. So the building at the right is a historic building. The two buildings at the left are actually new construction that meet the current flood requirements. So even if you are in a historic district and able to manage how high you allow historic buildings to be elevated, you have to also consider what might happen at a vacant parcel next door, because those buildings will be required to meet all flood requirements. Next, please. So this is an example of wet flood proofing. So the picture on the right-hand side is a house in Fells Point in Baltimore, and the back of the house was largely damaged. So I'm going to let Lauren speak more to this, but since it's my picture, I get to speak first, so I get to steal her thunder. So the bottom floor of the house, the lower level, is in the floodplain. If you look at the image to the top left, the two small basement windows are actually blacked out from the back and you can't really tell. And the basement has been infilled with gravel, which is a solution that you can use to keep the foundation walls from collapsing. The first floor is actually used for storage, and in the back of the building, which is the middle photograph, you can access a garage, which is the first floor of the building. And the upper two floors are the living space. Next, please. This is an example of wet flood proofing in new construction. Not really great. It doesn't happen to be in a historic district, but it was worth stopping the car for a photo. So there are a lot of ways to achieve this. The living floor for this is where sort of the window line is, which is what looks like sort of 1.5 stories above grade. And from the back, it is again garages. So with wet flood proofing, the things that are allowable in the wet zone, the flood area, are parking, storage, and access to your residence. Next, please. Dry flood proofing is literally keeping the water out. And we're going to see more of this at the library project. But in this, again, Baltimore example, the channels on the left are installed to accept the panels on the right. So in the event of a flood, those panels on the right are dropped into the channels, and you, in essence, you're trying to keep the water out through a barrier. Next, please. So this is an example from Manayunk. So on the left-hand side, the left and the right, it's the same opening. So pre-flood and during flood. And what typically happens, so this is the same deck I showed you on the other side. What typically happens is there's seepage under the panels, so you have to have a way of getting that water out. This happens to be an exterior location, so it's not that significant. Next, please. Perimeter barriers is another alternative. So this is a wall, again, with the same similar kinds of channels built in. And when the flood water rises, somebody has to physically be there to drop the panels in. And if they're not, then that's a problem. So this location is actually on a river at the Jones Falls neighborhood of Baltimore. And that river tends to rise very quickly. So making sure that somebody there is a problem. Next, please. Building relocation is another option. So the Park Service has had for forever, as far as I remember, kind of standards established for relocating buildings in terms of context, et cetera. In terms of what it physically means to relocate a building, it's very similar to elevating a building in terms of just picking it up off the ground and setting it somewhere else. The challenge is how you get from point A to point B with the building, but it's physically doable. But you might run into, the electric lines, the bridges, the overpasses, and all the problems that you have to negotiate to move a building. Next, please. And acquisition and demolition. So this is a town in Western Maryland. This was Main Street. And at the tree line behind the few remaining buildings is a river that flooded and blew out their Main Street. It was one of the saddest places I visited while I was working in Maryland because there literally was nothing left of it. So one of the things that FEMA does is actually, as a mitigation measure, instead of rebuilding, they acquire properties and demo them. This was a choice that actually in Ellicott City, where they had the 1,000-year flood 2 years, in 2 years, they actually did remove some of the buildings on Main Street to improve the overall flood resilience of that street. Next one. So in looking at all of this, I've really focused on buildings. What I haven't focused on is either landscape or archaeology. And one of the things to keep in mind that brackish water, the sort of somewhat salty water coming in, is in fact impacting landscape and things like trees, but also farming, et cetera. So people are having to relocate because they can no longer sustain themselves in the same way in the same places. Archaeologically, it's horrific because everything from cemeteries to archaeological remains are literally being exposed. Next, please. I don't know why some of these images aren't coming up. I'm sorry. So in looking at how we start to adapt to flood, one of the things that we tend to do is adapt our behavior. So we will note and drive a different way if the road is underwater. We won't park in the parking lot if it gets flooded. Next, please. But once it gets to the point where we can no longer be in a place, a lot of people turn towards migration. So this is an island on the eastern shore of Maryland. If you recall the causeway that looked like it went on forever, the industries have basically started shutting down, or not started, many of the industries have shut down. So when the industry shut down, the school is no longer there, the post office closes, and the church doesn't have enough people to operate, people start migrating, and families move on. And here we have, we end up with these historic relics of a community. And part of the question we have to ask ourselves is, as people are leaving a place, as preservationists, do we have an obligation to somehow document that place before they're gone? Is it really about the buildings, or is it about the community? And that's a much broader question, but we are starting to lose places with people and communities. Next, please. So I don't know what happened to all these images, but this is literally the last house standing on an island in the Chesapeake. So it's literally a building, supporting birds at this point. It eventually fell into the Chesapeake, but losing places means they're lost. So hopefully we can think beyond just about buildings in terms of preservation to the larger goals of how do we record our historic presence on a place. Next, please. Here we go. Gray boxes. If you are interested in the very long version of it, I would suggest looking at the New Jersey guides. They're more comprehensive than Maryland. And I'm happy to answer questions at a future date. Thank you.
So Dominique, thank you very much. That's a wonderful overview, and it really sets the stage for a lot of other things that we're going to be looking at this afternoon, and turn now to one of your cities that has adopted a lot of your plans, and that is Baltimore, where Lauren Schusick's work with the Commission on Historical and Architectural Preservation deals with both river flood risk and coastal flood risk from the same body of water, the Patapsco River, which empties into an arm of the ocean, the Chesapeake Bay. So Lauren, you have a lot to tell us about Fells Point and Baltimore.
I do. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be on this panel today. I'm going to talk about Baltimore City and try to cover it quickly. Next slide, please. So Baltimore City is no stranger to flooding, whether it's tidal flooding in Baltimore's Inner Harbor here from Hurricane Isabel in 2003, next slide, or from its rivers and waterways, like along the Jones Falls in 2017. Dominique mentioned the huge flood that destroyed downtown Ellicott City. This rainstorm, the same thing impacted our Jones Falls River Valley. Two rivers meet immediately north of this location at Meadow Mill, and the water flow can change from a trickle to a dangerous surge very quickly. And in fact, on this day in 2017, the water levels rose in a half an hour to the point where people were stranded on their cars in the parking lot. Luckily, there was no loss of life. And of course, interestingly, as we know, these places mills were built along these waterways for the water power that these rivers provided. And so what was once sort of the source of energy can now be a life and safety liability. Next slide, please. Another type of flooding that Baltimore regularly faces is urban flooding. And, this is not as recognized by FEMA, but it's still a problem. It's caused by high volumes of rain in short periods of time that overwhelm the stormwater infrastructure. And due to climate change, this weather pattern is becoming much more common in our region. And of course, this issue is exacerbated by large amounts of impervious paving. There's literally nowhere for the water to go. And so it pools in, the lowest place it can find. Next slide. So how are we addressing these issues? In 2013, the Department of Planning, where I work, produced the Disaster Preparedness and Planning Project, which we call DP3, which is a comprehensive approach to address mitigation of existing hazards and planning for climate adaptation regarding sea level rise, increased precipitation, flooding, and other climate change impacts. This plan was then updated in 2018. Also of note is that Baltimore City has participated for over 40 years in the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, which offers federally subsidized flood insurance. And Baltimore also participates in NFIP's Community Rating System, CRS. And Baltimore City has a rating of 5, which equates to a 25% 25% discount in flood insurance for property owners. So it's a pretty significant amount. Next slide, please. And we were able to achieve that CRS rating and make folks eligible for those discounts in part because Baltimore City has adopted floodplain regulations that are stronger than FEMA's. FEMA requires cities to regulate the areas that have a 1% annual chance of flooding. It's previously been called and still can be referred to as the 100-year floodplain. Folks are getting away from that terminology because it's flooding more than every 100 years. So, what we really want to focus on is what is the annual chance of flooding? And it's a 1% chance every year. But in Baltimore, we also regulate the areas that have a 0.2% annual chance of flooding annually. And we require an additional 2 feet of freeboard above the base flood elevation. We do this because flooding is going to significantly increase in our city by 2050 and even more so by 2100. And so what my colleagues are trying to do is plan for the environment that we will have in the future, not the environment that we have today. Next slide. And historic properties are not exempt from the floodplain regulations because we want our historic buildings and communities to be as resilient as possible for as long as possible. We have 37 local historic districts and over 200 local landmarks in Baltimore City. And we work hand in hand with our floodplain managers on mitigation projects for our locally designated historic structures. These are 2 recent projects that I have reviewed that include flood mitigation measures. One of which, the sewage pumping station, gorgeous, amazing structure. This building located on our harbor, right at the outfall of the Jones Falls, provides critical infrastructure to a large portion of the city. I mean, it is absolutely critical that it functions. And so we're working to ensure that it continues to do so in the future. Next slide. Our work doing historic preservation and climate mitigation is prescribed in the DP3. And so a few years ago, our department, with the support of the Maryland Historical Trust, received a grant from the National Park Service's Cultural Resource Hazard Mitigation Grant Program to enable us to begin to address 3 of the DP3's 8 historic resource strategies shown here. Next slide. And the product of this grant-funded effort is this document, which is geared towards the general public. The owners of residential and commercial historic properties in the Fells Point neighborhood. And it's really important to emphasize that we did not do this alone. The grant enabled us to hire Dominique Hawkins, who you just learned so much from, and whose expertise was critical to us for this project. And we also work closely with our colleagues and floodplain managers in our department's Office of Sustainability as well. Next slide, please. And the focus on Fells Point is very intentional. Its location along Baltimore's Inner Harbor makes it highly vulnerable to flooding, as can be seen in this digital flood insurance rate map from the state of Maryland. And as Dominique mentioned, these maps don't always accurately show risk. For instance, some of these properties are shown in orange, which maps the 0.2% annual risk of flooding. And some of those areas are actually very vulnerable to nuisance or sunny day flooding. So it doesn't quite capture the risk accurately. Next slide. Fells Point is one of the city's oldest neighborhoods with 18th and 19th century building stock and intact historic streetscapes. And it's both a National Register and local historic district. And Fells Point is defined by its relationship to the water. It was nationally important for shipbuilding. It was a port for trade. And it's one of the neighborhoods that will be most impacted by flooding, storm surge, and sea level rise. But it also is a microcosm of the city. It has a mix of residential, commercial, industrial buildings, as well as new construction. And focusing on Fells Point made our task a lot more manageable And the lessons that we've learned and will be applying here can then hopefully be applied to many other parts of the city. Next slide, please. Another important aspect of this plan is that it addresses row houses, which is a housing type that is ubiquitous throughout Baltimore. And here's the issue, is that the majority of existing guidance on adapting structures to flooding hazards, these guidelines are excellent in many ways, but they focus on detached structures. And so those guidelines primarily recommend treatments for residential properties such as elevation, relocation, and flood walls, which are not applicable to row houses. Next slide. And thus the need for the document that we're gonna just walk through very quickly here. It's an 18-page document. We wanted it to be manageable for the folks that we're serving. So I'm gonna talk about a few of these sections and how the document acts both as an educational tool and then as guidance for adopting flood mitigation measures for a property. And there's also a link to this document at the end of my presentation. Next slide. Defining terms. Hazard mitigation and historic preservation both have a number of specialized terms and acronyms. And so we've thought it was really important in our guidelines to make an effort to clarify these terms and explain them in plain English so that this document would be accessible to the people that we serve. Next slide. Oh, I forgot we had a pop-up. And then we have a list of acronyms too. Next slide. And the guidelines break down the types of flood mitigation efforts that one might have to undertake into two separate categories: basic improvements and building alterations. And basic improvements really covers simple maintenance of properties to reduce its vulnerability to natural hazards. And most of these are just common sense things that you should do for your property regularly anyway, but sometimes we get lazy and don't do them. And so this really emphasizes how important it is to do things like repointing masonry so that water cannot get in. Next slide, or sorry, there we go. Or, just making sure that your drains and downspouts are well maintained. And again, and clearing debris, just some really basic building maintenance issues. Next slide. Other examples of basic improvements, which while more costly, don't involve structural changes to achieve hazard mitigation. And so these could include relocation of critical systems and equipment. Next slide, shown here, as well as like elevation of some of these sources and installing secondary power sources. Next slide. But when flood mitigation involves building alterations, things get a lot more complicated and a lot more expensive. And these types of alterations are typically triggered by a substantial improvements to a property. And these alterations need to not only meet our local regulatory historic preservation regs, they also have to comply with building code and with the floodplain regs, which in Baltimore City are stronger than FEMA's. And so it's in this section that some of the hard realities of our near future of climate change really hit home. For example, the guidelines confront the fact that a homeowner may need to abandon the use of the basement, as Dominique had mentioned, and that the first floor may need to be reserved only for entry, garage, and storage. And so, as Dominique mentioned, this is an example of wet flood proofing, which is a flood mitigation measure that complies with Baltimore's floodplain management regs for residential, commercial, and institutional buildings. And the wet flood proofing is really sort of a living with water viewpoint. And in a lot of ways, it turns historic preservation on its head. We have to, in some places, we may have to abandon, functionally abandon parts of a structure and design for the building to be able to take on water regularly. It's really sort of sobering stuff. And the guidelines also emphasize the fact that those of us, including me, who live in attached housing already know, which is that what your neighbor does or does not do to maintain their property will impact you as well. The row house situation is a tricky one. We also wanted to be realistic about what homeowners might need to do to continue to live in their homes if they have to functionally abandon a half or 2/3 of it. And so you can see in this drawing that, there's a potential rear addition, which, build to the rear of the lot, maybe even build a floor higher than the original historic structure, as long as it's, the addition is set back enough from the street that it's not visible from the streetscape. What are ways that we can have these buildings continue to serve in the future, even in a world where they're going to be dealing with water regularly? Next slide. And as Dominique already mentioned, and I'm so glad she did, because I can sort of take my time back because I don't want to go over. This is an excellent example of wet flood proofing in Fells Point, where again, the basement was infilled. The first floor is only used for storage and parking, and the living spaces and systems are on the second and third floors. Next slide. And as Dominique also showed, this is the alternative mitigation measure of dry flood proofing, of having the perimeter walls and having the gates. And dry flood proofing does not comply with Baltimore's floodplain regs for residential properties, but it can be used for commercial and industrial properties. And so a barrier like this one installed at Meadow Mill can work very well in preventing water from coming in. However, next slide, please. If you remember that photo that we saw before, these only work if there's advance notice about a major storm, and someone has to be on site to install the barriers. They have to install them correctly, not upside down or backwards, which are things that happen when you're stressed out and working fast and trying to do this. I know I wouldn't trust myself to try to install flood barriers, in a panic. So I'm really excited to learn from our next speaker about other sort of more other practices that might be more effective for dry flood proofing. Next slide, please. We also show an example of the Sagamore Pendry Hotel, which is on the left here, which is a combination of a rehabilitation and new construction on the Fells Point Recreation Pier. And this is an amazing example of the incredible lengths that a developer can go to achieve a dry flood proofing standard. This project received a bevy of historic tax credits, and they also made a building that is literally in the water. They made it flood proof, which is just phenomenal. The first floor windows are all aquarium glass. From an engineering standpoint, historic preservation standpoint, it is really a phenomenal project. But this is sort of an outlier, because the majority of the folks that we are going to be serving are going to be a homeowner. Next slide, please. So we learned some lessons in this process, weighing historic preservation and life safety. The historic resources matter, but people matter more. And our primary goal is to help people live in their homes for as long as they can before we need to start talking about abandonment. These are difficult conversations to have, but they're really important. So we will continue to work as a team with our planners, our floodplain managers, and our communities to move forward and learn to live with water as well as we can. Thank you so much.
Lauren, what a great presentation. I'm really impressed that I think all of us can be impressed that in Baltimore, you achieved a rating of 5 in the community rating system, with a 25% discount for property owners. And you're also looking at the really hard issues of how we protect the community in general and really focus on people, not solely architecture and property. You've talked about the flooding from rivers and from basically the Chesapeake Bay. We're going to turn now to a third type of water intrusion, and that is rising damp. And for that, we're going to turn to Anna Sanchez, a former library trustee in Hoboken, New Jersey, who as a volunteer helped guide the library's massive effort to a dry flood proof an 1897 building that's on the National Register of Historic Places. And Anna has a whole alphabet of mitigation measures. Anna.
Thank you, Alan. So yes, as The library is fortunate that's a public building, and therefore it's allowed us a little more leeway than residential buildings. And for as much as we love our library, it's a place we visit. It's not the place that we live in. So as next slide, please. So as one of the volunteer trustees for the public library in Hoboken, New Jersey, we learned that our 1887 building faced a multiple of flood risks, including sea level rise, coastal storm surge, heavy rain, and a combined storm and sanitary sewer with a history of failing under pressure. To mitigate these multiple interconnected flood risks, we learned how to flood-proof our National Register building with a multitude of techniques from A to Z. Next slide. Hoboken is at the edge of the Hudson River, and we learned the hard way from Irene, from Sandy, and even from increasing and frequent rains that we needed to keep our building dry while balancing two important objectives: historic preservation and flood protection. So here is a very quick alphabet of adaptation. Next slide. Well, actually, this is, a brief segue is that the basement of the library was going to be renovated just as Sandy hit. And Sandy offered an opportunity for us to understand what the space needed to be and for us to sort of change course really rather quickly. So next slide is A, for an aerated wainscot that lets air flow behind the panels and lets us keep watch that the building stays dry. Next slide. Backflow preventers that keep rainwater from backing into the building's interior waistline. Hoboken, as I mentioned before, has a combined sanitary and storm system. Next slide. Check valves that mitigate, similar to the backflow preventers, which provide a similar protection since the library was built in a part of town that used to be a marsh. Next slide. The downspouts are diverted during storms in order to relieve water that could go through the building. It now goes on the outside. Next slide. And we installed ejector pumps to push water into the new lateral lines that added we added for better drainage into the city's sewer system. Next slide also shows floodgates. They were installed at all of the below grade entrances to the space. The next slide is G. G is for garden, and a concrete courtyard was converted into a garden that temporarily holds rainwater in 2 feet of gravel buried beneath the permeable top layer of artificial grass. And as a bonus, has become one of the favorite spaces within the library. Next slide. And high above the flood level, we installed generators to power the ejector pumps and to turn the library into a community refuge center during heavy rain, snow, or extreme heat. Well, if these events knock out the external electricity. I will now rush to the end of the alphabet, which is X for Zypex. And Zypex is a liquid solution that was used to waterproof the basement walls and parts of the floor. Essentially, we turned the basement into a bathtub that kept water out. And by being able to dry proof and to protect our basement, we expanded the usable space of the library by 33%. Next slide. So our experience here is Y is a resounding yes. Historic buildings can be flood-proofed while they retain their historic authenticity. And finally, Z, last slide, next to the last slide. And Z highlights the reality right there. Next slide. Okay. That many historic structures, as our previous speakers have talked about, lie within flood zones and near rivers, waterways, coasts. Our flood-prone library received $2 million in federal, state, county, and city funding that secured our National Register building while accommodating both historic preservation and resilience against rising water. Next slide. So during this project, we learned a lot about the ABCs of giving our historic building a future. Last slide.
So thanks, Anna.
Okay.
In a year in which we had our hurricanes went into the second alphabet, it's nice to know that the ABCs in Hoboken are holding the library in good stead against rising damp and all sorts of other water intrusion. This is a project that came to the attention of the National Park Service, and we're going to hear now from Jennifer Wellock, who's been instrumental in helping update the guidelines on flood adaptation and for rehabilitating historic buildings, and the library is going to be one of the examples in that. So Jennifer, I'd like to hear from you with a national perspective.
All right, thank you very much. It's been interesting to see all your projects. I remember them when they first came through the office, and it's fun to see them now again. I'm one of the authors of the Guidelines on Flood Adaptation for Rehabilitating Historic Buildings. This was released by the Park Service in last year, but we're putting out a new illustrated guidelines. And Anna knows one of her buildings, like we talked about, the library is in there, but so too is Fells Point, and so too is the Jersey buildings. So you'll all see friendly faces when you open it up. Next slide. Why the Park Service? Why did we do guidelines? Well, you can see why, because we're a steward of cultural resources ourselves, plus the National Preservation Act directs us to develop guidelines and technical information on the preservation of historic properties. Next slide. The Park Service is probably known best for our iconic parks like Yellowstone and Yosemite, but we have a number of community outreach programs. This list on the right is actually all of our community programs. They range from maritime heritage grants, national heritage areas. We also have grants we give to the state historic preservation offices and the tribal historic preservation offices. So we're a lot more than just parks, and we encourage you to look to our external programs for help and guidance and technical information. Next slide. The Park Service has a history of kind of going through and thinking about climate and climate change. We started off in 2016 and 2015 with these Coastal Adaptation Strategies Guide, which I recommend, that goes through coastal issues, which, you know, not every property has, but it's an overview of our park properties. And then we have the climate change strategy that came out in 2016. That's the picture you see here. Then we did some vulnerability and assessment modeling for the parks and their internal structures. And then the guidelines came, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in the next slide. So how did we get here? My office is the State, Tribal, Local Plans and Grants Division, and we fund the SHPOs and the TIPOs, the State Historic Preservation Offices and the Tribal Historic Preservation Offices. We do a number of grant programs as well. We have Save America's Treasures, Tribal Heritage Grants, African American Civil Rights Grants, but occasionally when there's a disaster, Congress appropriates money from the Historic Preservation Fund, which is what we manage, and sends it out to the states that have been damaged. And so we had that happen way in back times through the Iowa floods. Then we had Katrina, which you see here, the Katrina recovery pictures. And we started to learn a little bit during Katrina, because we're, you know, like I said, we're a management agency property, but we're not a homeowner. We don't pay insurance. So as we were talking to homeowners, we realized, oh, there's a big issue here. You know, we can't be like, look the other way. So what? You know, keep historic integrity. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of pressure financially, as well as, you know, what we're interested in, the preservation of the historic character, the sustainability of the site. So that's when we started to realize, oh boy. So this is one of our projects. The photo on the left in the Katrina recovery is what it looked like after the storm. And on the right is one of the grants that we funded. Next. We heard from our constituents. We heard from our state historic preservation offices. We got another grant for Sandy, which a lot of your projects here were funded out of. I think Lauren's came from there. Dominique's work for that, for Jersey and for Maryland came from that. Anna's project came from the Sandy grants. So that was another special appropriation from Congress for Sandy. Currently, we have Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria funding, and Florence, U2, and Michael. So those grants are started up now. Why the standards? So the standards, I just want to give you a little hierarchy of where the guidelines fit. So we have the Secretary of the Interior has been told to make standards that they then promulgate and kind of tell other federal agencies how to work. So we manage them, but that was just one of their responsibilities. They went down to the Park Service. So there's 4 treatment standards for historic properties: preservation, restoration, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. My office doesn't fund reconstruction, pretty much. I mean, if the left wall is blown out in Ellicott City, yeah, we'll put it back. We're not going to put back a building that's gone a long time ago. So we're going to be talking more about rehabilitation, which is the one we're more familiar with. That's the one that allows you a lot of change, put in new systems, but you can also think about using the tax credit. So take a look at the next slide. We have a publication series that's out there, the standards being the overall 4 treatment standards that you saw. Then we'd go down to guidelines, so that can go into each of those types of treatments. Then there's lower than that, there's preservation briefs, interpreting the standards bulletins, and tech notes. We haven't done tech notes in a while, but I think they're going to come back because of flood. So I think we'll see a little bit more the tech notes coming back to the top of the table. Next slide. So to use the guidelines that I wrote with my colleagues, Jenny Parker and Jen Eggleston, you had to be a Jen to be on our committee. These prerequisite is that there must be risk of flood. So you can't just say, oh, I like all these treatments, I'm just going to do them. No, there must be a risk. And that risk would be based on the flood maps that Dominique showed us earlier, or a past event, or something. We have to have some reason. This is a photo of a church in the Big Island. And I think the thing that was interesting here is a multi-level event. It was rising water plus rain event. And it was the first time they had seen this in such a long time. So, like you said, the climate is changing. Things are happening. We got to be ready. So we want to identify the flood characteristics we might want to fix, the property characteristics. And of course, this guideline document will go through the different treatments as they are acceptable within the rehabilitation standards. Next slide. Format is the same for each section. We go through the adaptation measure, the title, a description, any technical limitations, like flood proofing. A wood building is not going to work, so it has to be masonry. And then we do procedures that are recommended or not recommended. If any of you are familiar with the standards and guidelines for the treatments, that are not specific to flood, that's how they're all written. They're all written as recommended or not recommended. We don't tell you no, you cannot, because each building is different. Next slide. So of course, before you do anything, we want to make sure you plan and assess for the flood reduction you're doing. And we want you to go ahead and take, time to document the current condition. And like, I think one of you all said, maintenance, super important. First, let's make sure the gutters are clean. Let's try to do the low hanging fruit first before we do an adaptation. And you want to look at the vulnerabilities. So this is about try not to have a failure of imagination, right? Think about anything that could come your way. And think about also the existing capacity for resilience in the building. Some of the buildings down south were built with the idea that they might flood. Maybe they're raised on piers to allow humidity to go through the building, let airflow. Can we, over time, sometimes we tighten up buildings, because they're cold, particularly if you're in the north. So maybe look to see, is there any place we can get back some airflow that might help us in an event to dry out quicker? So looking for inherent characteristics that might help us. Next slide. So I'm not going to talk about each of these because my colleagues here have done a great job. I just want you to know that these are the topics that are covered. And as I said, there's going to be an illustrated guidelines. These are our graphics that will go with each section. But we have also, I believe, 3 to 4 case studies of properties that had to combine treatments, right? You can't just do one thing. I think utilities is the one almost everybody will have to do regardless of their treatment if they've had a storm, whether it's pulling out the HVAC and putting in new, deciding whether or not, well, okay, it's at the end of its life anyway, I'm just going to replace it with a new material or going to a different system. So I'm going to fly through these. So if anybody wants more questions, we'll get to it at the end. Let's just go fast. Next slide. Dry flood proofing. Next one. Next. Fill the basement. Next. Elevate. I think we know this one the best. This is the one that's probably the most incentivized by the federal government. Next one. The interior. This is my personal favorite. You get to keep a lot of the outside look. They used it in Fells Point there, but it's definitely one that I think works for historic buildings as long as you have the interior height, floor to ceiling height. Next one. Abandoning the lowest floor. Again, we saw that Fells Point example. Converting the first floor to parking or flood, doesn't matter if it gets flooded use. Next one. Moving, the Park Service, we don't love a move. We don't enjoy a moved building because it requires, particularly if it's listed, you're going to have to work with the State Historic Preservation Office to make sure the new location is approved. When the building is off of its foundation, it isn't a building, it's actually cargo. So your homeowner's insurance doesn't work. You have to get cargo insurance. There's a lot of issues here. Plus the power lines, the permitting, you usually need police to help you get the building through. Usually have to disassemble portions of it. So it is a bear. We just want to make sure you remember, get it out of the risk. Like don't move it 3 feet and then you're still in a flood zone. Next up. So yeah, the illustrated ones will come out early 2021. They're right now at the printer. I'm doing the captioning as we speak. And we should have them like, I think maybe February. So take a look, email me if you want them. And I will get them to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. This is great. You've given us a good overview and a good example of all of the different publications you're doing. It's very impressive. So now, because Resilient Cities really focuses on funding and financing climate resilience, we're going to turn to our final panelist, Janet Foster, who has served for many years in state government in the New Jersey Historic Trust, which has the wonderful job of providing grants and loans to preserve historic sites. So Janet, you're on.
Thank you very much. And next slide, please. New Jersey Historic Trust is an old organization, but we've become much more active since 2014 when a voter approved referendum shifted funding from periodic bond sales to an annual appropriation from the corporate business tax that supports open space acquisition, farmland preservation, and historic preservation activities. New Jersey is the most densely populated state in the nation, and as a result, open space initiatives are always overwhelmingly approved. Tying historic preservation and open space together for funding purposes has been a real boon to our preservation community. Next slide, please. Lucy the Elephant was built in 1881 as a seaside tourist attraction. She's still an attraction at the shore south of Atlantic City. Her porthole eyes look out over the ocean, but her wooden and metal body is constantly in need of repair as she is battered by storms and sunlight and seagulls. The Trust has helped keep Lucy in shape over the past 30 years. Open space has the larger constituency in New Jersey, much larger than historic preservation per se. But Lucy reminds us that there is no open space, there is no sense of place in our state that has not been shaped in some way by humans. Next slide. The Trust currently administers 3 different categories of grant awards for historic sites in the state. Eligible applicants include nonprofits and entities of New Jersey government. All grants require a match. Sites must be listed on or determined eligible for the state and national registers, and work carried out must meet the Secretary of Interior's standards. Next slide. Hardworking staff of 6 under the leadership of Executive Director Dot Guzzo works with potential applicants and follows through when projects are given the go-ahead through an independent grant review process. If you need to leave now, I urge you to jot down the information on this slide. If you have a few more minutes, I'd love to show you some of the pictures, pretty pictures of places in New Jersey that the Trust has helped support with resiliency issues. Next slide, please. New Jersey has coastal resources stretching south from the New York Harbor, up along the Delaware Bay and along the Delaware River. To aid navigation along the shallow edges of the bay, the East Point Lighthouse was established in 1850. Rising water threatens the site now. East Point underwent a complex restoration completed in 2019 that involved the Trust, the Army Corps of Engineers, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and a local friends group who operate the lighthouse as a museum and destination point within a complex of bayside marshes popular with birdwatchers. Next slide. Yes, there is a village in New Jersey known as Bivalve, and no surprise, it was the center of the oystering industry from the late 19th to the mid 20th century. Focusing on heritage tourism at Bivalve has helped keep buildings extant and a rich knowledge of the ecosystems of the bay alive. The Trust supports preservation efforts across a wide spectrum of activities to encourage heritage tourism. At Bivalve, the Trust helped to fund the creation of interpretive panels, a short film explaining the planting and harvesting of oysters, and research and design of an interpretive exhibit on the Cashier, a surviving National Register listed oyster schooner. Next slide. Bivalve is part of the Trust's online Journey Through Jersey website that directs heritage tourists to sites around the state, searchable by location, historical period, and interest areas. Capital investment in buildings are only as good as the use a site gets. And so the Trust wants to encourage visitors to these historic sites. Next slide. Up along the Delaware River, not far north of the city of Philadelphia, stands the Shippen Mansion, built about 1869 and a wonderful example of the French Second Empire style that was so popular at that time. After the Shippen family passed away in 1917, the property became home to the Red Dragon Canoe Club, popular with sailing and canoeing enthusiasts. Damage from Hurricane Sandy in 2012 focused the club on the condition of their headquarters. Federal Sandy relief funds were coupled with the grant from the Trust for a phased restoration of the building. All Trust grants require an easement placed on the building so that there is public access and protection of the building from inappropriate changes to the historic appearance and materials. Next slide. Water is the enemy of buildings, but the foundation of the industrial economy of New Jersey. Alexander Hamilton proposed a manufacturing center in a new city to be called Paterson in 1792. Its industrial processes would be powered by the Great Falls of the Passaic. The city of Paterson's industrial might was extended into the 20th century with the rise of electrical power produced at this 1914 power generating station. The station building is still in use, but decades of exposure to the mist generated by the falls had deteriorated the masonry. The Trust supported grants for masonry rehabilitation and repointing and repair of terracotta. This allows a historic building to continue to generate renewable energy and carry on our tradition of harnessing the Great Falls. Next slide. And finally, the Abel and Mary Nicholson House is an astonishingly well-preserved pattern end brick house, a type of vernacular building associated with 18th century Quaker communities of Southwest New Jersey. Built in 1722, it has never had plumbing or electricity, but it is now located on an island in the marshy lowlands of the bay, certainly not the situation when it was built. It is not open to the public except by special appointment, and then your access must be timed to low tides. but a trust grant helped fund the installation of non-invasive fire detection and suppression systems at this isolated site. We have not given up on it despite the rising waters. Next slide. So from fire suppression systems to repointing, from partnering with traditional historical organizations to open space conservancies, the New Jersey Historic Trust has developed a series of innovative grant programs to help support capital improvements in our state's diverse historic resources. We just opened on Monday a new grant round for 2021, and we invite inquiries from you if you are within the state of New Jersey. Next slide. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to share the work of the New Jersey Historic Trust.
Thanks, Janet, and thanks for introducing or letting us know about the grant round and also talking about dedicated funding. I'm sure there are people on this call who would enjoy talking further with you about that. I'm sure you'll make yourself available to be a focal point and a catalyst for those discussions. And thank you too for talking about a new type of water damage. I hadn't thought about rising water damage from the mist of a waterfall, but you've certainly illustrated the whole gamut, the whole range of how we are affected by rising water. I want to just thank our panelists and turn this back over to Anne Lockwood, because we have another webinar coming up, not tonight, but in February, and it will be on the subject of stormwater utilities. So Anne, do you want to give us a few details on that?
Yes, thank you. On Thursday, February 11th at 4:30, we'll have another one of our webinar series. We'll have 3 panelists who will discuss how to manage excess rainwater by creating a stormwater utility. Stormwater utilities collect revenue from property owners in direct proportion to the amount of a property's surface area that creates runoff rather than absorbing rainfall. To discuss this relatively new form of stormwater management, which is sometimes controversial, we'll hear from the 3 panelists. Jennifer Roberts was mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, and before that, when she chaired the Mecklenburg County Commission, she helped create a stormwater utility that generated revenue for voluntary buyouts of 700 floodplain residences in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area. Charlotte Katzenmoyer is CEO of Capital Region Water in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. She'll talk about a tale of 2 cities, how Harrisburg and nearby Lancaster, Pennsylvania address excess rainwater by having created stormwater utilities. From Pennsylvania, we'll go to another state capital, Concord, New Hampshire, where city engineer David Cederholm will walk us through the stormwater utility feasibility study that the city conducted last year, looking at examples of successful stormwater utilities in Maine, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. We hope you'll join us on February 11th at 4:30. And I think Stuart will put the registration link on the screen, and we'll also share it. Thanks everyone for attending. It's great to see so many of us making history by preserving history as we adapt to a changing climate. Thank you. Stuart, can you put the link in the chat for the registration?
And yes, I can. The easiest way to get to it is brazilcities.org. It's right on the homepage of our website now.
Let's see, I'm gonna type it in for everyone so everyone can just. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.